This is kind of an exciting video. It's the first PC build I've done since like the beginning of summer. And now that all the parts, just about all the parts, we're still waiting on the AMD GPUs to sort of land and see where they fall in line with performance. It's the first complete build I'm gonna do in quite a while. So that's why today we've teamed up with Hyte to build a pretty badass system inside of their pretty unique Y60. The Li & Li UniFan SL-V2 refreshes one of the most innovative fan designs we've ever seen. The completely redesigned interlocking key provides improved radiator clearance, while the 28mm frame provides 10% better airflow compared to V1. Interlocking fan frames allow for clutter-free daisy chain, providing the cleanest cable management possible. Available in black or white, the UniFan SL-V2 can be purchased either individually or a 3-fan starter pack, including everything you need to get started. To learn more about the UniFan SL-V2, follow the sponsored link in the description below. So we've already done a review of the Hyte Y60, or more so of an overview. It's my first time building it. So if you haven't seen our case overview, you should probably go and check that out. We talk about a lot of the nuances of what makes this case unique. But on a high level here, it's an interesting wraparound glass kind of a case designed to give you a perfect view of your components from pretty much every angle. It's got a complete updraft cooling system, which means all the air is intaked from the bottom, but any solid panel that is on this chassis is also a vent. So it's very different, very unique, which is kind of nice to, build in. I've seen builds in this chassis, everything from custom water-cooled rigid tube build all the way to AIO type cooling we're gonna be doing today. But anyway, links down below, you guys can go and check that out. Also too, the specs of today's build are very similar to an iBuyPower system that you would be able to spec out yourself. Because if you guys aren't aware, the Hyte brand is also under the iBuyPower name. So it's sort of an in-house chassis. So if you like what you see here, you can actually go and spec out a build very similar to this. Again, all the links will be down below. They sent us all these parts here for me to assemble. Hopefully I don't screw it up and we'll get a pretty amazing build. So let's go and talk about the parts. Obviously, the Hyte Y60 is kind of the centerpiece of this. It is an Intel-based system. They sent over a 13900K that we will be obviously putting into a Z790. I wasn't sure if they sent a 690 or a 790. It is a Strix Z790 motherboard. So it's got all the native feature sets you would find with 13th gen, which are pretty much the same as 12th gen, just a couple of extra differences you get. We've got HyperX Fury Beast RGB RAM, 32 gigabytes. Pretty standard now with DDR5, and this is a DDR5 build. You can also build Intel 13th gen with DDR4 if you want to, so it's a nice thing that you can save some money there if you don't need all of the extra speed DDR5 has to offer. But DDR5, you can get 8 gigabyte sticks. They're actually more rare. 16 gigabyte sticks is now kind of the norm, and the particular speed on this is 6,000, so pretty fast. Our storage is a 2 terabyte 980 Pro NVMe SSD from Samsung. Plenty of storage, definitely get you up and running, but this motherboard will support multiple NVMe sticks, so we could get up to like 8 terabytes or more of storage, which is kind of nice, but nice fast controller on there. And then our graphics card, this is an MSI RTX 4090 Supreme. We had a little bit of a discussion internally about the 4090 when it first launched, and just like many other brands, they were kind of holding off on finding out what the root cause of any of the RTX 4090 failures, specifically the adapter cable, was. And so now that we've kind of moved forward, and Steve has done a great video about what a lot of the root cause was on that, you're starting to see 4090s appear in builds again, because we have a lot of other options to help mitigate any of the loose connector problems that tends to be the root cause of any of the failures there. We're going to be using the Corsair native 12 volt high power adapter cable that's going to plug in directly to the H1200i or the HX1200i power supply, so we don't have to deal with the adapter at all. So there is this. And then with the cooler, we are using the iCUE H115i Elite Capellix. So obviously we have plenty of RGB in here. And then for the case fans where necessary, we have some SP120 Elite RGB fans here. The idea with this case and this particular build is the fact that you can get the benefits of having better water cooling for your particular CPU and GPU, but not have to go all out with custom water cooling, which you absolutely could do in this case right here. Now, obviously we have to build it. So we're gonna go ahead and just kind of take you along for the ride, see how it looks when we're done. Because to be honest, I don't know. I haven't built in this case before. You know, I gotta tell you, this is probably the most anticipated case to build in for me personally, not because of the fact that I just thought it was cool when we did our overview of it, but you guys kept asking. The audience was like, Jay, do a Hyte Y60 build, do a Y60 build. And I've seen a bunch of builds in this chassis. I've seen, like, this is a dual AIO, obviously. So we have a CPU with AIO and a graphics card with an AIO. And I think the layout like this, with utilizing the back motherboard tray and then the top as being the only mounting points, it works well, because as you can see, I have them Velcroed together. So all the tubes at least go in the same direction rather than looking like an intestine going everywhere, which you could end up with if you had a front mount. So then they would be going different directions. But there's so many little things. It's not until you build in a case that you truly know where its strengths and weaknesses are. One of the things I didn't even notice the first time we did our overview of this chassis is on the back of the case right here, there are cable ties. And I was like, why would you want cable ties on the back? And I thought, that is so that you can actually cable manage your USBs and your Ethernet and capture card, USB-Cs, whatever you want to the back of this. Could be cable tied, zip tied down, or even Velcroed. They're big enough, wide enough for Velcro straps to be able to then have the back of your chassis managed, because you can see through all these vents and stuff and you don't want them kind of laying all over the place. So little stuff like that. But when you look on the back side, behind the motherboard tray, that's where initially the depth seems like really awesome when it comes to cable management and stuff, and it is. The cable management in the build initially went very smoothly, where I was having things tightly routed. I was having cables folded back on each other and zip tied down to make them the lengths that I wanted without having to cut them. And it all was great. When I looked at the 1200 watt power supply, the HX1200i, it's a very long power supply. With the length of that power supply, did not give me a lot of room for the cables to fit behind it. Fortunately, there's enough depth to make up for the lack of length space left. So I was able to have those cables really just sort of bunch up in there. The thing is, to do any sort of cable maintenance on this at all, if I have to unplug something or whatever, I've got to take the power supply out at an angle, unplug things, and hope nothing gets tangled or caught and pulled out as we go. But if it wasn't for the fact that Hyte had included the sleeved Corsair power supply cables, which are paracord and very flexible, I think the stock cables would have been very difficult to fit in there, because they're all bundled up in a single sleeve, which makes it very stiff and rigid and hard to turn. The only downside in terms of cables, as a side note, is, like I said, the rubberized cable coming from Corsair for the 12 volt high power is not individually sleeved. Therefore, it doesn't match the rest of the sleeves. But, you know, these are the things we do to make sure that we have perfectly safe, systems and stuff here. I was a little worried that the gunmetal color of the shroud on the MSI 4090 was gonna look out of place, but it really doesn't. It looks great. Everything's just set to RGB puke right now because of the fact that we don't have an OS or anything on it yet. All the RGB control is gonna be done through iCUE, because iCUE can actually integrate with ASUS motherboards. And since this is an ASUS motherboard, I can control all of the RGB through iCUE, with the exception of the graphics card. Fortunately, the graphics card is not set to RGB puke like everything else out of the box. It's just a pulsating white. I think if I were to have swapped the fans on the MSI cooler with RGB fans, I think we would have then nice balanced lighting over there. And for me personally, this is the kind of build that I would probably set to either maybe like a turquoisey blue or just white. And just solid, no blinks, no flashes, just a nice solid white light. Because of the fact that we have tinted glass, the lighting is not super bright. It's not like blasting light at your system. But because we did replace the case fans in the bottom and the rear with the SP120s that were provided for this build, we have a little bit of underglow going on here. You can see the lighting down through the grill. Those intake fans on the bottom are supplying cold air right to the graphics card. Remember, the graphics card does still use a fan on the shroud itself to cool things like the memory and the PCB. And the VRMs. So the core is being cooled by the AIO, and then everything else is air cooled by the fan shroud. So nice supply of cold air is good to it. We do have almost 2 slots worth of thickness, about 2 slots of thickness between the glass and the graphics card, because this is not a triple slot or a 4 slot card. So if I were to be using an air cooled card right here, the fans would be getting really close to this glass. So this was actually the perfect card to put in here, not just because of the fact that it's AIO, it has plenty of cooling, just the fact that it doesn't squish it against the glass, which could suffocate some air-cooled cards, which means the intake fans on the bottom being 120s might have even needed to be 140s to get as much airflow up to the GPU as possible. But the nice thing is on the backside, absolutely tons of options to route your cables. You've got grommets everywhere. The entire height of the motherboard tray is a different angled grommet shield, which I've showed you before. It's not the typical flappy rubber. It actually is like a 45-degree kind of a scoop. It just keeps cables nice and tidy, and it keeps the cables from the backside poking through, because believe it or not, those cables are pushed against that grommet really hard right now because of getting it all to fit, like I said. But tons of tie down spots. You could use zip ties like I did. You can use Velcro straps. You can use bongo ties, twist ties, whatever you want to hold your cables down. Lots and lots of options. I didn't end up using the 3.5-inch storage bays for anything other than housing the Commander Pro that comes with the H115i Elite, because here's the problem. The size of that thing doesn't fit in the bottom, where basically I double sticky taped the RGB controller for the SP120s, which, fun fact, the Commander Pro that comes with the Corsair cooler will not be able to control the RGB fans on the SP120s, because the SP120 has a different controller than the fans that come with the Elite Capellix, which means that the controller can only work one or the other. So that's a downside. It's not segmented where I could say, output 1, 2, and 3 of RGB is for SP120 and 4, 5, and 6 are for this particular type, because Corsair has like, what, 10 different types of RGB product now that have to be programmed in their controller. So I had to use the RGB controller that comes with the SP120. Fortunately, now they have consolidated that into a single little unit instead of having 2 separate units. But the Commander Pro that comes with the cooler is too big to fit down there, and still have the plugs come in the side. Remember, one side is 6 fan outputs, the other side is 6 RGB outputs. So I chose to use one of the sleds to mount it to there, which I think actually looks pretty neat and it's easily accessible. But at the end of the day, building in this chassis is, I wouldn't say challenging, because really the only thing that made it challenging was the length of the power supply. And if you're not using a super long power supply, I mean, here's the thing though, you can, from various brands, like even EVGA, I've got a 1000 watt platinum power supply from them. That's a standard length. Now, the efficiency and the components have gotten so good with power supplies these days. They've continued to get shorter and shorter back to just standard length without the extra length, giving you the ability to have high output without taking up a ton of space. We've got 2 exhaust 140s on the top, an exhaust 120 on the back, and technically 2 exhausts on 120s in the front. This is a negative pressure system. So I left all the intake filters on everywhere they exist. Normally I take those off for better airflow, but because this is basically negative pressure with all these exhaust fans, only 2 intakes on the bottom, having ventilation and filtration is important. One thing I could have done is flip the fans around on the radiator for the MSI and then make those intakes, and then we would have had a nice amount of intake versus exhaust balance. So there you go, guys, the Hyte Y60 first build of the season. You guys have been asking me to build in this now for basically the majority of the year. And I'm kind of happy that I did. But don't forget, if you are not the kind of person that is not comfortable building your own system, which I'm always going to advocate for, Cyberbauer PC do basically have like this exact build you could basically order if you wanted, or you can customize it and choose your components which meet your budget and your demand for games. So you can kind of decide what games you're playing, what kind of FPS, what kind of budget you want, spec out a system, they'll build it, they'll send it to you, they'll support it, they'll warranty it, the whole deal. So there you go, guys. Check out the description down below. A huge thank you to Hyte for supporting us and giving us these parts to do this build to showcase for you guys. And if you were to build in a Hyte Y60, what components would you choose and why? Thanks for watching, guys. And as always, we'll see you in the next one. And don't forget, the all-important question, Intel or AMD?